Today in this video, Miles Burgoff's about to share with you a pattern that's very timely and can put big fish in the boat for you. Than myself, I'm going to share a very sneaky pattern, a pattern that the experienced anglers do not want you to know about. Then Matt Steffen's going to get in depth in a pattern that's consistent across the country in any lakes that has grass. Stay with us, guys, then let's go get into it. Bass Fishing Declassified is brought to you by Fish the Moment. One way you can support the channel is by going to fishthemoment.com and checking out our map lake breakdowns, checking out the one-on-one virtual lessons. We also have sonar guides and informal virtual seminars as well. Now, hey guys, let's go get in to see what Miles has to say about fishing in the summer.
All right, everybody, so it's summertime and there are a ton of different patterns for you to be able to go out there and catch fish. But one of the patterns that has a very narrow window of opportunity, but it is a blast, has got to be the mayfly hatch. You know, across the south, all the way up north, there's a huge hatch that happens during the June, July. Usually those are the 2 months that it really happens, despite the name being mayfly. But you have a huge hatch of these insects. And when I talk about huge hatches, I'm talking about, you know, within just a couple week period, you have millions of these things flying around and attaching themselves to all types of vegetation around the shoreline. And it's just a great window of opportunity where all of the ecosystem is just at heightened awareness and actively feeding. And so what I look for, especially on the TVA here, is I've really learned that it's hard to beat a bluff wall bank when it comes to the mayfly hatch, because there's a lot of things going on that make it conducive for mayflies. Number one, you got deep water that's generally pretty oxygenated. It's really you know, good habitat for those emerging mayfly. You got lots of rocks, and then you also, outside of the water, have a lot of low-hanging shrubs growing off of these bluff walls, vines growing off the bluff walls, trees, and that combination allows those you know, mayfly to emerge from the water, where they primarily live around the rocks, and then once they get up to the surface, they can cling to that vegetation and dry their wings and all that and go through that whole process. But it's just perfect for them. And then all of the forage species that the bass love to eat, they're feeding on these mayflies. So like crawfish, panfish, you know, everything's feeding on these mayfly, and then the bass are right there behind them. So what I like to do when I'm targeting these bluff walls is not necessarily try to imitate the mayflies, but try to imitate the forage species that are feeding on the mayflies. So I really like throwing a jig because that imitates both a bluegill and a crawfish really well. This right here is a football jig I've had a lot of success with out here on the TVA, especially Chickamauga. This is the Z-Man Cross-Eyes football jig. Great jig paired with the Helicross trailer. And I like to use that on 12-pound test, a Brazex from Seagar, a 7.3 medium heavy all-purpose series rod, and kind of like an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio VLD10. That's kind of the setup that I like to use for the bluff walls. But really, it's all about, you know, fishing slow when you start getting into those areas, work that jig all the way down that drop, and there will be key little stretches where the bite is the hottest. So just pay attention to where you get those bites and make multiple casts to those areas. But overall, it is just really hard to beat that red hot bite that you get with the mayfly hatch.
Okay guys, Miles just shared some juice on the mayfly hatch. I know I have a lake nearby that, man, the mayflies will get in there certain areas, man, that when you get on it, when you get them panfish and them bass around, man, you can load the boat. Now, before I talk about my little sneaky pattern for lakes in the summer, I'm just going to share with you guys real quick that I've started a podcast. It is called Real Life in Fishing. Hey, check it out after this video. It's on Spotify, it's on iHeartRadio, a couple other podcast platforms, and also there's a YouTube channel on it. Now, hey, let's get into my summer fishing pattern. Okay, guys, the pattern I'm about to talk about is for highland reservoirs mainly, but it can happen in lowland reservoirs, but it depends on the water clarity, and it also might be a little shallower for you if you're a lowland reservoir guy. Like, once again, depends on the water clarity. But for the highland reservoirs, we're talking some clean water, 4+ foot visibility. What can happen is in these months, you know, we have the brim that are spawning in June, July, August. Well, they will not all spawn up on the bank or in your spawning coves. Some of these brim will spawn on offshore areas. They can be off points, they can be off humps, but guys, they are spawning in 10 to 15 foot. And what happens is when you have these brim beds that are in 10 to 15 foot, what some very experienced bass anglers do, and some of the old tricks that they pull out, is by planting brush piles by these brim beds. And so then for you, when you go find brush piles, okay, with your side imaging, you need to look and see if there's brim beds nearby. Or you go look on some of these offshore areas for brim beds and then see if there's a brush pile nearby. What happens, of course, is the bass will use these brush piles to kind of hang out in, and then when they want to go feed, they go out there to the brim beds and feed. Now, how you target these brim beds, okay, how you can target them in these depths, there's two ways I'm going to talk about. One is an easy way, and then one's a way that I'm going to actually kind of go for here on. I'm about to try. I've just pulled these lures back out. I caught some fish with them last year, and I'm going to talk about those second. But the first way, guys, it's an easy way, a big worm. I'm not going to get in depth on the big worm. I have my big worm pole right here. I got a Zumo monster. If you've watched enough of our videos, I throw 3 worms, the Zumo monster, the Big Bite Baits B2, and then I also throw the 6 cents, the Busa worm and that Ridge worm, okay? So I'm not going to get in depth on the worms. But this next lure, okay, I'm going to talk about. This next one, and I caught fish with it last year, and I also made a video on Fish the Moment with it involved last year. But this right here is the Megabass Sleeper Gill. It's a little swim bait. It's a soft swim bait, but it looks like a brim. They have patterns that look like shad as well, but this is just one of the brim patterned ones. Now, as you see, this is one that's been used. It's been beat up a little bit. Hopefully you can check it out. I'll try to get you some up close camera footage, but I'm going to be throwing this at some of them brim beds this year. I have one right here in the package as well. Like I just said, I just kind of realized that I've not thrown them this year and I'm pulling them out. So if any of you guys watching that are my local friends, yep, and you're asking me here soon when I'm catching them on, it's probably about to be this guy, okay? So, now with this, of course, you can do this, guys, without forward-facing sonar, okay? Because this was something that people did without it. But if you have forward-facing sonar, of course, it's going to be easier because you can then see you can probably potentially see the brush pile, then you can see the brim beds, you might be able to see the little brim swimming around them, and then be able to see a bass or a bigger dot go out there and attack them. And one reason I want to throw this thing swims really good in the water, okay? It does look pretty good like a brim. Now, you can throw this shallow, too. But this little guy right here is just a good brim imitator. This paddle tail does a good job with the kicking, and I was really impressed with these last year when I did my underwater footage video with them. Now when I'm throwing this guy, okay, as you see right here, this is my Denali Coverlight 7.2 worm and jig rod. I have thrown this dude on this rod, okay, with swim baits, and this one too. You don't want nothing with a stiff tip, okay? This is a medium heavy action rod. The tip's good enough and has enough bend to where it allows them to swallow it, and also allow this thing to make a good thump. Now somebody might be watching this and say you need to use this rod or this rod, but me, I don't have 20 rods. I try to have a rod for each situation, but I don't have one for every. And I actually only have 2 swim bait rods, and they got something else on there right now. But this isn't a giant swim bait. It's not a glide bait. As you see, it's a perfect little size, and this is what I'm going to use to go after these brim beds with these bass and brush piles nearby. Okay, guys, now let's see what Matt has to say about fishing deep grass lines, deep grass edges during the summer.
Anytime you start talking about summertime bass fishing, you have to consider fishing the outside deep weed lines. By far one of the best patterns that you can run for not only finding numbers of fish, but also giving yourself a chance at a true giant. This holds up around the country. Up where I live in the northern part of the world, natural lakes, deep outside weed lines, probably the best thing you can do all summer long. But if you happen to live down south, maybe Lake Ouachita in Arkansas, maybe Lake Gunnersville in Alabama, down in Florida, any of these places, during the summer, your deep outside weed lines are going to be an absolute must hit for you. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. First off, that weed line provides a great place as an ambush location for the bass to feed. Generally speaking, the deep outside weed line is going to provide a little bit cooler water, and it's going to provide some shade depending on where the sun is positioned to that outside weed line. All of that combined makes a great place for bass to be holding. It generally is one of those things where what you're going to be looking for is some form of irregularity in that weed line. Maybe it's a weed point, maybe it's an indent in the weeds, maybe you've got an isolated weed clump that's away from a giant weed flat. You want to identify those irregularities. Another thing to look for when it comes to the irregularity is a depth change. So if you've got a large weed flat, a lot of times you might have a drain or a small ledge that will actually change the appearance of the grass. So if you've got maybe a ledge that goes from 8 to 10 feet, maybe the grass is extremely thick from 8 feet and shallower, but from that 8 to 10 foot mark, you get sparsed out grass. That outside weed line right there is going to be a key place to be looking. Now, from a bait perspective, you can throw almost anything at these outside weed lines. The key here, though, is you want something that's going to come through the grass clean. So if you're throwing a bait with a pile of treble hooks, it might be a little bit more difficult. Now, having said that, one of my favorite baits to actually search that grass or to identify where there may be a school of fish holding is a crankbait. So yes, it does have treble hooks, but the thing here is I'm going to try to parallel this along that weed line, trying to make maybe an occasional piece of contact with some of the grass. But generally speaking, what I find is the fish, when you have a big school of fish that are holding in an area on a weed line, you're gonna be able to catch some fish that are out away from the grass. So if I can go down a clean outside weed line with a crankbait like this Berkeley dredger first, that's going to help me identify where there might be a larger school of fish. Now, once I've identified where that larger school of fish is, or what I'm hoping it is, that's when I like to slow down with a casting jig like this guy right here with a Maxcent Berkeley chunk trailer on the back. This is a very weedless bait, and I'm going to fish this though in a manner where I'm actually throwing it into the grass, and then instead of trying to drag it out of the grass, I'm actually ripping it hard. I'm going to stroke the jig through that grass from the point where it's in the grass to the point where I'm actually outside of that grass line. Generally speaking, most of the bites are going to come as you come through that weed line, so they're going to be holding right on the edge. Now, I do have one really important tip for you anytime you're fishing deep weed lines. This is something that often goes very overlooked and is not discussed that much, but your sun position is going to be key anytime you're fishing the deep weed line. And the reason for that is if you're fishing the sun so that it's at a position where you're getting a shadow cast off of the deep weed line so that the shadow is actually extending out into deeper water, those are going to be places that I tend to prefer to fish because the fish are not necessarily going to be buried up in the grass. A lot of times they'll actually pull out of the grass and hold in the shade that's being formed by the grass line. Makes them much more accessible to the angler. If you happen to be fishing a weed line where the sun is coming at an angle and it's hitting that weed line directly, what happens a lot of times is the fish will actually push further into the weeds. That makes them harder to catch. It makes it harder for us to get a bait to them. But generally speaking, I love throwing a crankbait to find them. I love throwing a jig to get them to react. And then lastly, a lot of times I'll slow down with a Texas rigged worm just to kind of pick apart that grass and try to get down in it a little bit better. But that's my 1-2 punch. If you happen to have a lake in your area that has a good deep outside weed line, do not